Welcome to Let's Talk Memoir, a podcast for memoir lovers, readers, and writers. I'm your host, Ronit Plank. Let's Talk Memoir is also a Substack newsletter. About once a month, I publish memoir craft advice, answer questions about memoir writing, and share my latest classes and upcoming events. You can go to substack.com and subscribe to Let's Talk Memoir for free. You can also find me, Ronit, on Instagram and on Blue Sky. Today, my guest is Bridey Thelen-Heidel, who is a teacher, TEDx speaker, and cast member of Listen to Your Mother, New York City. Her memoir, Bright Eyes, earned a Zibby Award Best Story of Overcoming, New York City Big Book Award Distinguished Favorite, and runner-up from the San Francisco Writers Festival. A fierce LGBT plus youth advocate, Bridey has been celebrated by the California Teachers Association. She's also partnered with NAMI and numerous domestic violence and child abuse resource agencies, speaking about defeating our monsters, but also learning to live without them. Welcome, Bridey.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate this, Ronit.
Oh, Bridey, I'm so happy that we're doing this together. And for those who are watching as well as listening, I'm holding up your beautiful memoir, Bright Eyes, with your Zibby Award right there. So congratulations on this book and writing this story and doing all that you've been doing to promote it. We have so much to talk about, and this episode is going to not only include writing craft and your experience getting this book into the world, but also some of the tips you are so good at sharing about how we can promote and market ourselves, because you are a force, and I can't wait to dig into that as well. So let's begin by having you share a little bit about the memoir, Bright Eyes.
So Bright Eyes is a story about me growing up with a mom who was addicted to everything, including dangerous men, and my kind of life with her. So growing up as her protector, her shield, her confessor, sometimes her punching bag. And it is that story of growing up with that parent. And then it's also the story of leaving that parent and leaving that codependent relationship, and how I moved on and how I let all of that go to live a life that I kind of had to create from scratch, right? So I definitely think it's a story that I have found a lot of people can relate to. So that makes the vulnerability worth it.
Yeah, you show up again and again with such vulnerability. And I know you've been sharing the story quite a lot, because beyond writing it and promoting it a little bit, you also we've been on a panel together at a festival. And I know you do a lot of speaking and talking, and you have this book to reference. And I know people want to know about your story. So I guess we should probably leave a little time in our interview to talk about how you take care of yourself when you talk about these things all the time and have to revisit your experience. And I think that's really important, because it comes up for memoirists. I know that you're a teacher, and you've been a teacher for a real long time, and you're an award-winning teacher. And I'm curious about your writing evolution. When did you begin writing creatively with an audience in mind? And what kind of classes or programs did you especially appreciate?
I started writing creatively really young, because I think, like a lot of people in situations where you're not allowed to talk about things, you end up writing down things to process them. And so I had, the little red velvet diary with the lock.
Yeah. Same era. I'm the same
Yeah,
era.
exactly. And then that morphed into college, journals where I wrote really bad poetry and went to open mics and shared when I shouldn't have. And I just kept writing down these stories because I just didn't talk to anybody about them. And when I finally realized there was going to be an audience was about 5 or 6 years ago, when I decided I was going to write the book. And it was after a really amazing event that is the end of the book. And I thought, this is the end of my book, and I'm going to start writing it. And I started writing it. My first audience was myself. And then my next audience was a writing group that I trusted. And then after they kind of validated that my writing was good, I realized that there was a book here. And so I just kept writing scenes. I think, you always write for yourself as your first audience, right? And I wrote for the little girl in the book, and I wrote for the teenager in the book, just to share our story.
Thank you for sharing about that. How did you decide about the structure for Bright Eyes, and when did you know you found one that worked?
Well, I had, as you had asked in the previous question, I had taken some memoir writing workshops, And that was kind of the catalyst for me putting together stories that just felt like they needed to come out first. Once I started really writing, I couldn't keep up with my typing or my handwriting. It was kind of weird which ones came out first. The stories that came out first were the ones that were the hardest really to deal with. And I think the ones that were on the surface, the ones that were really had been making me physically sick, developing like CPTSD, as they now call it.
Which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yeah.
Complex. Yeah.
And so when you have these memories and they're stored in your body, and I was getting really physically ill from them, and an acupuncturist suggested I maybe resolve some of my trauma. But once I wrote everything down, I am a person who's very coachable. And so I had my writing group, but then I also consulted an author who I love. Her name is Alice Anderson, and she wrote a book, Some Bright Morning I'll Fly Away. And I took a chance and I asked her if she would edit my book. So I hired her to do a developmental edit, and that changed everything because she see the story in a way that I couldn't. I moved a lot. I moved 22 times before I graduated from high school. And the book was kind of like that. It was like a challenge for the reader. You had to jump back and forth, and I had it in 4 parts that completely made sense to me. She was really great. She's like, you can't do this to a reader. It's too much work. It's like you have to have like a Hobbit map on the front.
So what did you do? What were the biggest changes that came about from that?
So she said, literally, she said, take it down to 2 parts from 4 at the most. And she said, have it linear. And so, other than chapter 1, which is when I'm 10, after I'm 10, I go back in chapter 2 and just start at about 4 or 5 years old and just go linear from there. And that was plenty. And it actually works really well. And it develops the story in a way that makes sense for the reader. It's a really fast read from what I've heard. I'm really grateful that she gave me that advice. And I do feel like as writers, sometimes we get really precious about what we've done and we get really protective. And, once I realized I wanted an audience to read it, I needed to let go and really trust somebody else's opinion. So I'm glad I did.
Oh, I really love the way you frame that, because what I'm gathering from our conversation so far is that you felt pretty rooted early on, that you were writing this for yourself and exploring the material and figuring it out for yourself. And then you got sort of connected to the structure you had and the 4 sections, the big sections. And then you realized through working with Alice Anderson that you needed to make it digestible for the reader so that the reader could follow along and really invest in your story. So these are the phases. These are just the beginning phases of memoir, or some of the phases, because we do go through this, most of us. And I think that it is hard to shift our thinking about our project. And yes, I can get precious about my words too. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was going to say, no, I never do that. But I definitely do. You can get really precious that it's so vital the way that we said this one thing or the way our sentence is ordered. But I find that the reader will really go along with you if there's something that you're trying to say. And even if we move it around a little bit, if the writing is good, it stands for itself, I think. And also there's this Duran Duran element. And without giving away the book, I have heard people ask you, or I've read in interviews, the way that you anchored or sort of connected your story to this sort of pop culture phenomenon. And I'm wondering if you want to talk about that a little bit, and maybe how it impacted your framing of the book.
Yeah, well, I think the story of Bright Eyes is pretty heavy. My growing up was, I don't like to play the dysfunction game because a lot of people had it way worse than me, but it's a pretty heavy story. But within that, I'm not a heavy person, right? And my experience within it, I also had moments of lightness, and I also had moments where I wasn't dwelling, I wasn't stuck in bed all the time. I was living my life. And part of that joy in my life, I actually learned from this band Duran Duran, 1985, and I was in 7th or 8th grade. I learned through the writing of the book that we often trauma bond with music, right? So it becomes the soundtrack, as we've heard so many times, the soundtrack to our life. And we trauma bond because what's interesting is that these celebrities or musicians, in my case, they can teach you emotional intelligence that you don't really have. And so I was in 8th grade. I was going through one of the hardest times of my life up until that point with my mom. And I could only have emotions that were hers. If she was happy, I could be happy. If she was mad, I could be mad. If she was sad, I could be sad. But I couldn't have any emotions outside of hers, or it would upset her, right? But then I found this music. And it taught me this emotional intelligence. I could shut my door, I could dance and sing, and I just became kind of invested in that process. And so this band and these records, through all my moves, I stuffed them into pillowcases and black trash bags, and I took these records with me everywhere. That became a thread in my life. And as I was an adult, trying to kind of make up for a childhood that I didn't have, I moved to California and I could afford to go to concerts and I could see them. And then there became this goal of wanting to meet them. And my students, I teach high school English, and my students were on board with that. And it was kind of their idea. And so then that becomes kind of a whole nother piece is I lived this life that was my mother's for so long. What is my life? What's my dream? What is something that little Bridey at 13 would really deserve to see happen? I wanted to have that go along in the story too, because I think that when you grow up in these environments, you don't really learn to dream. You don't think dreams are going to come true. You don't think you deserve to dream big. And I did. And I dreamed the biggest dream I could have, including publishing. So,
Yeah, that's beautiful. I have a few questions about writing trauma. My first question is, how did you take care of yourself while working on the material?
that is something I hope people do for sure. I didn't really realize how hard it was going to be once I unearthed all of these stories that I had tucked so carefully away and kind of living this nice life for 50 years. I'm 53, so I started writing the book at 48. So the way I took care of myself, I leaned on my husband. My daughter would write a scene and then go climb in his lap and cry a little bit or talk to her. I also took up hot yoga. Which was really great because I live in a very cold place. I live in Lake Tahoe. And so I was writing in the dead of winter a lot. We have winter for 10 months a year. So I took up hot yoga and would go to yoga and I would journal really while I was in a pose. Quite honestly, I also stopped drinking. At the time, I was looking at all these memoir writers who I loved so much, and they had at some really pivotal point stopped drinking. And it kind of was when their careers and their books catapulted in their stories. And so I also didn't have a drinking problem. I just drank a glass or two of wine a night, but I felt like I didn't want to write this book about this alcoholic mother while I was drinking wine. I also didn't want to be at book talks or doing interviews, like book clubs you get invited to. I didn't want to be drinking wine, talking about this experience with my mom. So anyway, that's another way to prepare myself, is just reserving all that energy and making that I was as healthy physically and mentally as I could be.
Yeah, I love also the hot yoga. I do that along with my husband many times. And it is a nice way to shake off the day. And it's yoga, but the change in environment, the climate is just really kind of shakes loose some things, not just, making you more limber, but it really does help you sort of go into a different zone. And so I can see how that would, right? Doesn't it? Yeah.
In your pelvis, when you do like the pigeon pose, the pelvis, you're releasing these stories. And I would find that I'd get into a pose and all of a sudden all this stuff would come up. And so that's when I would write right next to me in the
Did
dark
you?
room.
You would bring it to a class with you, huh? Your
Yeah, I
book.
just brought a journal and I would just, because I didn't want to lose those thoughts. And so
Oh,
I just,
yes. I
yeah,
do find myself holding on to ideas and trying not to forget by the time I get out. And it's funny that you mentioned pigeon pose because I love pigeon pose.
yeah,
I'm always looking forward to getting into pigeon pose. We have that in common. I didn't know that about releasing stories and pigeon pose. That's really interesting.
it's the mother. You hold the mother in your hips and in that
Holy,
area.
holy, wow, I did not know that. Well, when you think about the material that you cut, so we talked a little structurally about your developmental edit. What else did you do to know what material to keep and what to cut when you were in the later stages of revision?
So that is tricky, I think, for people because, you feel like you got to tell every story. And if you talk to any editor, they will be very candid and say, no, pick a plot, pick a through line. I'm an English teacher, right? So I'm looking for like motif and repeated images and symbolism. And I realized I took these huge Post-it notes when I had all my, basically the draft I gave to the developmental editor. I took a big, huge Post-it note and I charted out literally literary devices. What literary devices are running all through this story? What are the symbols that are all through the story? What are the motifs all through the story? And I realized yes and no. I realized that I had all these early chapters where I was saying yes to my mother and no to myself. And then I had these later chapters where I was saying no to her and yes to myself. And so I started picking out all the points and all the stories where I said yes and all the moments where I said no. And that became what I decided was my story. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I love that you did that with the motifs. It's very fun to get into writers, memoirists' brains and figure out how they organized, how they grappled with this. Because were you ever frustrated or overwhelmed in the earlier stages of revision?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an English teacher, I'm an editor, right? That's all I do every day is edit kids' work. And I didn't know if I could write. You get really frustrated because I would try to write like Maya Angelou, or I would try to write in these other places, and I would take them to my writing group, and they were great. They're like, this does not sound like you. This is not working. And so it took me a long time, as I know every writer watching this knows, it takes you a long time, I think, to find your voice. It just takes writing over and over and over and giving yourself permission. So I think that was the frustration, was me being this person who's read all these books and teaches all these books. I kept trying to sound like other people.
Yeah. Well, it's a place to start, right?
Yeah. So a little mimicry is okay, but then I realized, and I think that's why I slipped into present tense in my book too, because I ended up, that was the easiest way for me to find my voice, was just to be the kid going through this at each age. And I just stayed
Yes.
very true to her at that age, and her eyes and her experience and her lack of wisdom and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I know we talked about this a little bit on our panel, and in a moment you're going to read an excerpt that we talked about as well. But our panel that we were on together at the writers' conference was Daughters of Memoir. And I asked you
Mhm.
something like this when we were in conversation there, but I do want to share on this interview what was important for you to convey about the dynamic between you and your mother. I think writing about this kind of abuse and trauma and this really enmeshed relationship with a mom who's so many things, including a narcissist. And what did you want to convey about that dynamic that was important to you?
At first, I was just conveying how pissed I was.
Right, because was that a newer found being pissed? Because, here's the thing. I want to just extrapolate here. I think this is true, but you can just tell me if I'm being a bad interviewer and this is not true, and not to put words into your mouth. But is it sort of like you're living through it, you're trying to survive, you're playing by the rules of the family dynamic and the family system, and you don't have a voice or an option or a choice? And then later you find your voice and you find those glimpses of freedom like you did when you listened to Duran Duran, and those other moments when you're free from the family system. And then when did you start to really go back to feel the anger and the understanding of what had occurred?
It definitely took me going back into these stories. It took me to 48, 49, 50. I'm of a generation, we didn't go to therapy, right? We just, again, we sucked it up. And so in order to feel anger, at least for myself, that's also feeling love. Like, I have to care about you enough to be angry at you. And that was something I had to turn on with my mom. I had to remember when I loved her. I had to remember when I cared enough about her to be angry at her choices, because I was protective, right? So that was really hard to go back and open myself up, because I haven't spoken to her in 22 years, and she's still very much alive. So that was really challenging, was to open myself up to being angry at her, because then that also opened me up to being caring
And
and
hurt, yeah.
yeah, and hurt, and loving her enough to be hurt by her, right? That's a challenging thing for memoir writers.
And so was that something on the top of your mind to convey, or did you have to get drawn to convey that tenderness by editors, or did you know right away, oh, I have to do this in a multifaceted fashion?
Well, I think the dynamic I wanted to convey was that I really did, in order to stay in a relationship with this, you don't have to stay in a relationship with a parent. We're told to, we're expected to, you're supposed to be faithful to the family. As I write in my
Mhm.
epilogue, you go to TJ Maxx and you got to buy the signs about family is forever and thick and thin. And I think what I wanted to convey is that I loved the idea of my mother. I didn't have a mom. I had a mom maybe when I was 4 or 5, but I loved the idea of my mom. And that was enough to keep me in it and to keep me trying to fix her for a long, long, long time, because I wanted to get back to that feeling. And I think I talk about being addicted to her. And I think that's an addict, right? It's like being addicted to that first hit. I imagine I'm not an addict myself, but my dad was, and she certainly, my mom is. But I think there's that feeling of, I wanted that feeling back. I wanted the protection when I was 4. I wanted the sweetness. I wanted her sober. I wanted all these things. And so I feel like the dynamic I was trying to convey was getting back to that feeling all the time and finally realizing it wasn't coming back. She was never going to come back. There was never a mom. And I think for so many of us, that's reality,
And that's a very painful admission. If you can get to that point of realizing it, it's a huge loss.
Yeah, and I had to grieve her, right? I mean, I talked about that in the book. I had to bury her alive. I had to let her go because, again, it was the myth of her, the myth of the
Yeah.
mother, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I was hoping you could read that first excerpt we talked about on page 91. And maybe it's good for you to just maybe let us know how old about you are at this point in the book.
I was 11 years old and my baby sister had just been born, and I had been given the task of being her father because there wasn't a dad around. And so I have realized that my mom was an alcoholic. I was 11 and a half, almost 12, and I had the realization that she was drinking a lot, and it was kind of finally coming clear. So this is when we had just moved into some low-income housing, and we were really excited to live in this beautiful new townhouse that nobody else had lived in, and things had been kind of normal. And then the mother comes back, right? So there'd been a little bit of living in the myth for a couple of months. It's the weekend, and I want to stay away from my mom because she finished her morning pot of coffee and has moved into her jug of red wine. I decide to take Bevins to the playground. Mom is standing on our porch talking to a couple of friends on the porch next door as I try to slip by her. Where are you going? She asks. The playground. Why? What did you say? She cocks her head to the side, and I know I'm in trouble. Sorry, I just meant, what else should I be doing? Because the house is clean. Because we're facing the other moms who are obviously watching, Mom pinches the skin on the back of my arm to keep them from seeing. Mom, you're hurting me, I whisper. Don't you fucking move, she says, without moving her lips, except to smile at her friends. And don't you dare ever ask me why. If I say jump, the only thing you ask is, how high? She waves at the other moms. Be right there. Tears fill my eyes, but I'm trying not to cry. Do you understand me? She pinches harder. It's my turn to answer without moving my lips. Yes. She lets go of my skin and gives me a fake smile. Now, take all the kids to the playground. I swallow my tears and walk Bevins to the other porch. I'll take the kids with me, I say to the moms, offering my other hand to another toddler and heading down the sidewalk with a trail of little ones following behind me. Mom calls out, Hey, Bridey. I turn. Yeah? Jump. She nods to the other moms to be sure they're watching the show she's putting on for them. Again, humiliated by what she's doing to me, I take a deep breath to keep from crying or screaming and swallow. Looking around to make sure no kids my age are watching, I start jumping and call out to her. How high? She and the moms laugh a little. But when their kids start jumping next to me, the moms lose it, slapping each other's backs and spilling wine on themselves.
Thank you. There's this other section that I wanted you to also read, which is later in the book, and that is on page 212. And this speaks to what you start to remember and encounter about your experience. And I would love for you to read that too, if that's okay.
Yeah. So this is when this is the night before I'm graduating from college, and she's come to graduation and she's drinking really heavily, and we're in a fight. And there's a lot of parents, there's a lot of people. I went to a pretty fancy private college. And so I am now going to confront her. And so I'm walking toward her to confront her. And as I'm walking toward her, I start having kind of this vision, and this is the vision. When I was 6, I had a red plastic 3D Viewmaster that flipped through slides when you drop in a story disc. Disneyland was my favorite because the picture of Cinderella's castle was so vibrant that it felt like I was actually standing in front of it. Then I pressed the plastic lever that went ka-chunk, and I began writing It's a Small World. Watching Mom taking beers from our fridge and shoving them in her purse, our story disc drops in front of my eyes. Ka-chunk. I'm 7, smoothing her hair back while she cries about Jeff. Ka-chunk. I'm 10, wiping blood off her face after Al leaves her on the floor. Ka-chunk. I'm 12, watching her wave my winning essay in the air. Ka-chunk. I'm 13, cleaning up my sister's Burger King barf. Ka-chunk. I'm 15, calling my dad to break his heart. than putting out her fire. Ka-chunk. I'm 21 and being accused of kidnapping instead of a thank you. You know what, Frankie? Stopping her as she heads to the front door. I push her against the wall at the top of the stairs leading down to my room. I am better than you. I did all of this by myself. You did nothing to get me here. All you did was make it harder. She pushes me back, poking her finger in my chest. I made you. I am the reason you're here. I've given you everything I have. Lucky me. I grab her finger and shove it hard enough that she loses her footing and grabs my shirt. I pull her off me and she slips down the stairs, but grabs me again, taking me with her. We hit the landing at the bottom, and as she tries standing, I shove her into the unfinished drywall, denting it with her hip. Fuck you. She stands and holds the handrail, hauling herself back upstairs. Shaking with adrenaline and more anger than I've ever felt, I get to the top of the stairs. My head is spinning. What have I done? I've tried so hard not to be like her, but what I just did, raging out of control, is her. I'm going to be sick.
Thank you, Bridey. I'm thinking about having you read those sections, and those are charged sections. And, I appreciate that you did. And also, I'm sorry because those are tough. I mean, a lot of it is tough. A lot of your book is tough. And I did pick some of the harder sections. So thank you for being willing to read them. You don't have a relationship with your mom, as you mentioned. And what is it like for you to talk about her and read about her in service of book promotion and to share your story?
Well, the very first interview I did last summer before my book came out, the woman was very nice. We got done with the interview and she said, "You're going to have to say the words, my mom." And I started laughing. And she goes, "Because you talk around her." And obviously, her name in the book is Frankie. That's not her real name. And she said, "You're calling her Frankie. You're saying this woman." And she said, "You really need to say my mom." And that is a phrase I have not said in over 20 years. And so that is how hard it was at first. It was very hard to jump back in. And I had to walk around my house saying, my mom, my mom, my mom, because there's a completely different feeling, right? If you call your Nana, or your Grammy or whatever, there's a different feeling with the name. And my mom is an extremely different feeling than if I call her Frankie, right?
Yeah.
That is that letting in. I'm way better at it now because, of course, I've talked about it so much. And I think one thing about writing I found is that when you write these stories over and over and over and you drafts and drafts and drafts, they do become stories. And I am 20 pounds lighter now. And these are not my stories. I'm not emotionally attached to them really anymore. It's this little girl in this book. And I'm so proud of her. And I love her and I want to pay her as many kind of compliments as I can and kind of award her courage, but it's not my story anymore, So
Yeah.
I don't feel like I break down in tears and I don't get really caught up in it. But I do want to say, though, I am mindful of audiences that people are grappling with their relationships with their parents. And so I don't want to be cavalier about my separation from her, because I hope I covered in the book enough that I really did have to grieve her. And it was very, very, very hard. And it took a very long time. But once you're at the other side of it, it's very liberating and very free. And it just feels great. She's out there somewhere.
Well, I'm wondering, I know we're going a little bit long, and I thank you for your patience with me, but I was hoping before I let you go that you can share a couple of tips for indie authors, hybrid authors, and self-published authors, and really any author when it comes to launching their books and getting their memoirs in front of as many people as possible, because you have sold so many copies and you have been out there in front of this book and promoting it and talking about it and sharing generously when you show up in writerly circles. So what would you recommend to those writers who don't know where to begin?
So I kind of boiled it down for myself, and I feel like this is easy maybe to use, hopefully, into 3 C's. So the 3 C's really that I have found that work. Number one is come up with a plan, right? What was my reason for getting my story out there? What was my plan? Did I want to go big and sell thousands of copies? Or was I happy just getting my story in the world? Right? So we know both of those authors. We know both of those people. I personally needed to go bigger because I'm a hybrid author. So I paid to have my book printed. I have money invested in this. It's a small business in terms of me. I am the business, right? And so, I'm a public high school teacher, so I don't have tons of cash. And so, I wanted to make sure that I was investing in myself like a business. And so I am invested in selling my story. I'm also, part of my plan was that I wanted to get it in front of as many people as needed it, right? So because I feel so strongly in the message, I feel like I wrote a book that can really help people. And so in order for me to get it out there, I have to tell people what it's about, right? So the first C is like, come up with a plan. What are your expectations? I'm still literally on a book tour 9 months later. What are your expectations? A 2-week book tour? Do you want to be on bestseller list? Are you going to hire a publicist? So that's the first thing. I think the second C is confidence. So having confidence to tell your story, having confidence in your writing and in your skills and in your message, having confidence to post on social media, like get friendly with it, having confidence to show up when you're invited to things and not saying, oh, I don't know if I can do a podcast yet, or I don't know if I can be on a panel, or I don't know if I should do that, right? And if you can't have confidence in yourself, have confidence in the character you've written about. And so in my case, I have confidence in little Bridey, right? I have confidence that little girl needs her story out there. And then the third C is to collaborate. So I think one of the keys is collaborating with your writing group, collaborating with other authors. I think one of the very best moves I made was doing a hybrid publishing deal with She Writes Press, right? Because I am surrounded by a community of women writers, and we show up to each other's events, we help each other, we promote each other, we celebrate each other. And I am sure I can give them credit for having my book get out into the world. And the other collaboration I would suggest is that if your book is tied to any organizations, and in my case, domestic violence groups, child abuse advocates, all of that, collaborate with those groups, right? So you come up with a plan, have the confidence to get out there, and then collaborate with your communities.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was lovely.
Yeah.
That was so succinct too. I guess you've been asked that advice before, yeah?
No, I haven't. I actually was just thinking about it today. I was like, what? No, but it is so true. I mean, isn't that what we have to do? It's like,
Yes. Yes. And saying it that way, presenting it that way makes it feel like you can take a chunk out of each one. It's very understandable. And well, okay, I'm going to ask you, what are a few books you want to recommend of any genre that have informed your writing process or that you feel people need to read?
so there's obviously the ones that everybody talks about, right? The Art of Memoir and Bird by Bird. I would also throw in there Fearless Writing by William Canower. It's a fantastic book that helps you just get brave in your storytelling. I think it's Rachel Herron, 48 Hours to Write Your Memoir. And that's a really cool one to give you kind of a structure and a plan, and to make it feel like it's something that you can actually pull off. And Big Magic, right? Elizabeth Gilbert. So those are the ones I think that a lot of people love. But yeah, that Rachel Herron and William Canower.
Yeah, you're the first one to mention them.
Yeah, Rick Rubin also. Rick Rubin is a famous producer down in Malibu. And his book, let me get it right here, is The Creative Act. And that I needed at the end. So when you're kind of waning and in the woods and you're like, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, that's great.
His book, Creative Act. He gets you writing. He gets you in your really authentic space. His Audible is great because it's his voice.
Oh, yeah, that's great. That's a good tip. I'm going to add that to my Audible right now because sometimes I don't have the bandwidth to read more books, but to listen to the ones that are great, that's a great idea. Okay, well, you've been giving advice for a while now, but is there any last advice you'd like to share with writers working on their memoirs?
So in thinking about this, I think that my best advice, truthfully, would be fourth C, the calling. Like if you are called to write your story, whether your friends tell you should write it, whether your gut tells you should write it, whether you read, in my case, The Glass Castle, and you go, hey, I kind of resonate with this book, right? I think if you have a calling to write your story, just start writing it. Because I feel like we are not allowed to have imposter syndrome right now because there's so many unqualified people running the show right now. Yeah. They just have the confidence to do it. And I mean, in my own small local world here, I look around and it's like, so instead of getting imposter syndrome and feeling like you can't do it, I think if you're called to tell your story, just start writing it down, just start doing it. And I think that it turns into if you build it, they will come, right? If you start writing, the stories show up the doors open, the muses come, they help you, the path lays itself out. So you start writing and don't talk yourself out of it, because that calling is there for a reason. And so I think that it either wants you to tell yourself your story, maybe it wants you to tell your kids your story. My daughter just said the other day, she said, man, I wish all parents would write their story. She said, I think it would be really amazing for kids to know their parents' stories. And then really, if it's something you really want to do, then you put it out in the world. Pay attention to your calling, listen to it.
Thank you. Where can people find you, connect with your work, and get a copy of Bright Eyes?
So Bright Eyes is luckily in all kinds of great places, thanks to She Write Press and Simon and Schuster. So you can go to Barnes and Noble, you can go to bookshop.org, you can order it from your little indie that. And I'm at BrideyThelen-Heidel.com, and I'm on Instagram as Bright Eyes Author. I think you could just Google me at this point.
Yeah, and I'll have all those links in the show notes, as I always do, along with the books you recommended. And what a treat to talk with you and to spend this time with you. I'm so happy we did this, and thank you very much for being my guest, Bridey.
Thank you very much, Ronit. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Memoir. For more about this episode and my guest, please visit the link in the show notes. You can also find the complete catalog of Let's Talk Memoir episodes at ronitplank.com/Let's Talk Memoir. If you'd like updates about upcoming memoir workshops and memoir writing resources, you can subscribe to my Substack, or you can sign up for my newsletter on ronitplank.com. Those links are also in the show notes. And lastly, if you like this episode and the show, please go ahead and share it with your friends, and you can also subscribe. And if you have 2 more minutes, you can rate and review it on your podcast platform, which really does help other people find the show. Thank you so much for being here.